got this going.
Awesome.
Tracking. Fantastic. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve from Beaverton, and I get the privilege of introducing Amy McLaughlin from Oregon State University, and she's going to be sharing inclusivity in information systems design and implementation. So, welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
Are you okay with staying far back? We're trying not to get cold.
Oh yeah, that's totally fine. I'm all good with that. As long as you're not in the back row, because I'm not sure I have enough voice to project that far today. So I want to talk about, I'm going to introduce it to a little bit of background story. So we'll start with a little history lesson. I don't think it's news to anybody who works in K-12 that we have, and in higher ed, we have challenges with things like achievement gaps, gender disparities, all kinds of things. But we're not unfamiliar with this. So I'm going to take you through like a little discovery piece that I've gone through historically wise. And I also want to add a disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about inclusion, and I'm specifically not talking about disability. I did an extensive amount of work with OCR on web accessibility, and I think those kind of topics, like I could talk for a day and a half, and I have about 50 minutes. So I wanted people to know that I'm acknowledging that I specifically did not include that because there's a huge amount of great material on how to develop systems for inclusion for people with different kinds of disabilities. And it's not that it's not a worthy topic, it certainly is. It's just a different subset of this topic that I'm covering today. Oops. So people are going to start doing math now. So this is 1979. I'm standing on the deck of the USS Kitty Hawk with my dad. This was an amazing experience. Back in the 1970s, the United States Navy would take dependents out on one-day cruises, and I was on the flight deck with my dad. I got to see the planes landing and going off, and we were out somewhere past San Diego Harbor. And this was awesome and inspiring and really cool. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I would love to work on an aircraft carrier. Just one small problem, which I discovered just a few months after this photo was taken, when they said, hey, now, we're going to fly everybody 8 years old and older out to Hawaii, and they can come back in on the ship from Hawaii to San Diego with their dads. Let me preface that with everybody 8 years old and older, and I was 8, who is a boy. So welcome to Discrimination 101. I learned really early that girls don't get to do cool stuff in the military. Now this is changing, but it was a barrier to a career that I really was interested in at the age of 8. And so this is one of those hardcore in-your-face lessons. Then I learned some interesting things about things you can't change, like your nation of origin. So in the 1980s, in 1980, we moved from San Diego to Great Britain. Now, I sound very American, as you all can tell. My mother is actually is British. And I'm a dual citizen, so all the British people I run into, they're like, wait, you're a British citizen? That's weird. But in 1980, I went to live there, and one thing I couldn't change was people's perception of my nation of origin. And no matter how hard I tried to be as British as possible, I was always the American. And I was always treated differently because of that. Now you think about that, of things you can't change. Things you can't change when you wake up in the morning is your race, your gender, your nation of origin, or the perceived nation of origin. You might have been born in this country. You might be a third-generation student who happens to have family that came from Mexico, and people still walk up to you and say, what are you doing in our country? Well, that's totally offensive, for one, and it's based on an assumption that you are not, your nation of origin isn't the nation that you're in, or some aspect of yourself, like your accent or your skin color. So that was an interesting lesson in like the impact of things you can't change. In 1988, I ran into some other fun things around STEM, such as the quote, girls don't belong in math. That was my 11th grade math teacher. Girls don't belong in math. And my mom was in a bachelor's degree program in biology, And she walked into class, and the professor started off with, "I don't like women and I don't like foreigners." These are barriers to instruction and success. But these are really obvious. By the way, you'll see from the picture, this is my sister. She's like my twin, except that she's about 4 shades darker than I am, because we have mixed heritage. And so we have very interesting and different experiences based on that, too. We're just a hodgepodge family. In 1998, came to work at the state. I became I call it 1 in 10 in information security and cybersecurity. There's about 11% of the people in that field are women, which makes for an interesting experience. And this is where I start to become really aware of messages that come in, not the obvious ones, right? Everybody knows it's an obvious message when your teacher says, "Oh, women don't belong in math." That's really obvious. And you can, to some extent, go, "Yeah, whatever. I can ignore you because you're just being difficult." But there are quiet and subtle messages. And in 2014, I really dug into how much power data has on a day-to-day basis, and I did it quite by accident. And as I started to think about it, I started seeing it everywhere. So in 2014, I was working at the Department of Education. Some people will remember this. And I got this phone call that seemed so benign at the time. One of our district data people called and said, "Hey, I have a student who is transgender, and what do I do? Because our grade sheets keep printing out Bob, and their name is now Jane." I was like, "Well, change your name." Right? This seemed obvious to me. But it wasn't, because our systems aren't necessarily designed to handle multiple names. And they're not necessarily designed to handle changes. And as I dug deeper, I found that we build systems based off of old-fashioned paper processes. And I've actually been guilty of building some of these, so I'll own that. You know, if somebody hands you a form and says, "Make this electronic." Anybody else done this? Yeah, okay. But what I start to realize is that there's downfall to doing that. And it opens us up to building into systems which appear at the outside to be benign and neutral, and they kind of present that way. Everybody looks at a computer and says, "Oh, this is a neutral thing. It's not biased. It's a computer." But it's built by a person, and that person comes from a culture, and that stuff actually can filter into the experience. So in that process, I went through and accidentally set state policy by writing a little memo that said, yes, you can change a person's name and you can change their gender, because there was nothing that said that this was sex assigned at birth. It was gender, which is a different description. And all of a sudden I became, by accident, the statewide expert on supporting transgender students, which is something I actually still do a lot of work in and I'm really passionate about. But it was an accident that I started there. So part of the challenge in IT is that there are only 2 types of people in the world in IT, right? This is the old joke. There are 2 types of people, those who understand binary and those who don't. We all know this because all code goes back to ones and zeros. At the very standard base level, it's all ones and zeros. The problem is that it both introduces and reflects binary thinking that starts at the very basics. Now I'm going to tell you right up today that the changes I'm proposing aren't going to necessarily solve all problems, but they are going to add to an environment where people feel more included. So binary thinking becomes a serious challenge for us. And it helps us build in cultural binary notions into our code. So we all know that you have this model of how things are, and then you have reality. So when technology meets reality, our systems don't always know how to compensate. So in order to kind of explore this topic, we're going to just establish a couple key definitions, which you probably are aware of, but I'm going to pull them out anyways. So social exclusion is a state in which, this is the UN definition, individuals are unable to participate fully in an economic, social, political, and cultural life, as well as the processes leading to and sustaining such a state. So that processes that are built in that exclude some people from inclusion. A little bit more challenging is institutional bias because it can be more subtle. And institutional bias is a tendency for the procedures and practices of particular institutions to operate in ways which result in certain social groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged or devalued. And so some examples of this are institutional racism, institutional sexism. I'm going to pick a real-world example of institutional sexism that people didn't even realize. It was unconscious in their heads. Harvard did a study of, I can't remember which symphony, but a symphony back east that couldn't figure out why men were better musicians because the symphony was almost all male. And they were like, but women play instruments and women are capable, so why is our symphony all male? So they looked at the audition process, right? And they started breaking down the audition process, and the first thing they looked at was, well, maybe there's a bias against females, so if we put everybody behind a screen, then we should see a more equal distribution, because we're going to assume that women are as talented musicians as men, so we're going to hear just the music and not see anything. So in theory, this should have worked. And it did sort of have a slight increase in the number of women. But they were like, that's really odd because really it should have been higher. So they went back and analyzed the process again. And what they realized is in symphony, when men they wear like a black suit and black shoes. And women wear usually a dress or slacks and high heels. What kind of sounds do high heels make when they walk? Click, 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 right? So what was happening is that a man or a woman would walk into their audition, and unconsciously, the people listening to the audition would hear their shoes. And it would trigger, oh, that's a male or female. So they started having musicians go bare, like in their sock feet, into the audition, and guess what happened? It equalized. Seriously. So, Harvard study. Fascinating, right? So they took the blind audition and made it a blind sock foot audition.
Maybe men are worse musicians than their dad.
That's a great point. Who knows? The flip side of exclusion is inclusion, right? The state of including or being included within a group. And I think in education, this is what we're striving for. How do we make all our students feel included and be participatory in the educational experience? And this is a challenge because we have a huge, diverse range of students, not just in where they come from, but their academic ability, their experience, their backgrounds, the things that shape who they are. But there's an impact to feeling excluded that becomes cumulative, and this is why I want to talk about what seem like little things. Like people are like, why would you nitpick at data? Who cares? But the reality is that exclusion becomes a cumulative impact. It's not just this event and then it goes away, and this event and it goes away, and this event and it goes away. It is this event adds up to this event adds up to this event adds up to the point where you hit a breaking point where you're like, I'm just so done with this, right? This is ridiculous. Y'all don't want me. It builds on itself, and so even little like things that you might think are little become big. Like being called by the wrong pronoun becomes big because it's like rubbing a rash. It keeps irritating. You can't stop it, and it becomes a problem. The other things that happen is that when we're working with data and we're working with questions that we ask people, is you can inadvertently trigger stereotype threat. And if you're not familiar with stereotype threat, essentially, you can actually trigger in somebody a response that says, oh my gosh, I can't do this because there's a stereotype that as a woman I don't do math. Or as a person of color, my language skills aren't, I'm not expected to pass this test or whatever. So this has been found in study after study after study that depending on when you ask questions on certain demographic pieces, you can trigger a stereotype response that says, I somehow don't belong here. and cause somebody's performance or their inclusion, their ability to do stuff, to go down. So you start adding these little pieces up and they become big. With systems that don't look at how to include all kinds of people, you also sending people messages like, I don't belong. I'm not here. I'm invisible. I can tell you from very personal experience, the experience of being invisible is horrible. I actually went to a school for 6 weeks in Great Britain where I was literally invisible. The teachers wouldn't talk to me. The students wouldn't talk to me. They'd beat me up. They wouldn't talk to me. It was like the most bizarre experience ever to feel like you were literally fading away. And to have that experience that's just projected at you from things like a question on a form. Well, I don't have an answer for the question because I don't fit your boxes. I am now fading into invisibility. The other thing it can do is make people feel not safe. This is particularly true for our gender non-binary, transgender students, students who are LGBTQ. Safety is a huge issue. So when you have systems that don't support their safety, for example, don't allow them to have the name that they want to be called appropriately, it can trigger a safety issue in the brain that then impacts learning. So something as small, seemingly small, as my name is wrong on the grade sheet, you just called me Bob and I'm now Susan, triggers a huge safety issue in your brain. When you're not safe, you can't learn. Now, there's a really interesting thing about brain science. If you're really comfortable and you don't have tension at all, you are generating dopamine and serotonin. And you're good. You're in good space. You have a good grip on your topic. If you are in a slight area of risk, it's new, I'm uncomfortable, your brain generates oxytocin. This is actually a great place for learning because it's that edge of risk where I'm not terrified, but I'm like, ooh, I want to learn. This kind of here is where I want students to be. Students who are in danger, who feel threatened, who feel unsafe, their brains are pumping out cortisol. They're in fight or flight. They are not learning. They can't physically learn because they're in fear. So if your form or your grade sheet says, is putting a student in danger from the minute they walk into the classroom because that substitute just called them by the wrong name and wondered why a person who looks like a girl is answering to Bob, that is a problem. That's generating fear out of a system that everybody thinks is a neutral event. Everybody with me still? Okay, good. Okay. You all work in education. I'm not going to belabor the outcomes of exclusion. I'm just going to run through some of them. For transgendered students, LGBTQ students, these are our highest risk population. I might have made myself a little unpopular at ODE when I just point blank said, our goal is 40-40-20, right? Our goal is to graduate students. Dead students don't graduate. I hate to be blunt about it, but it's true. Dead students don't graduate, and for transgender students particularly, but also for other LGBTQ students, one of the biggest challenges is safety, mental and physical health. Murder rates, suicide rates are highest in any population in transgender populations. Second to that is LGBT, or the lesbian, gay, bisexual communities. Here's 90% of transgender people experience employment discrimination. 20% experience discrimination in housing. 41% will attempt suicide. 41%. That is a huge number. That means if you have 10 people in a room who are transgender, that means 4 or more of them have tried to kill themselves. Outcomes for women are really noticeable in terms of stereotype threat and in terms of exclusion from specific areas. In higher ed, women outnumber men. is of students. Like, it's like 48 to 50 some percent. But in terms of graduating from technology programs, this is data for engineering graduates. 82% of engineering graduates are male, but they're only like 45% of the people going to college. So these are real world outcomes where you see population impact by messages that come through both obvious and subtle. This, by the way, is graduation rates across STEM fields as opposed to liberal arts. Again, for women. And you'll see that, at the low end, 10% of the population of a field in computers and aerospace is 14%. The very highest they get is to 49% in environmental science, which has a slightly more gender accept. I don't know. But again, not representative of the population who are going to university.
Where do you see the problem beginning?
Where do I see the problem beginning?
I mean, in terms of public education, do you see it at the younger grades, or do you think it's a high school problem?
I see it starting really early, and I don't think it's just in college or in the education. I think it's the social messages. Like I said, today I can't solve all those problems. I'm just going to tell you how not to be part of them in terms of how your systems are designed or the systems that you select. Because you can see it in a lot of places. We had a great conversation last night with one of our counterparts from Washington about the social messaging and how you don't see, until recently, you didn't see like strong technical women on TV. Thank you to the Arrow and Felicity Smoke. You now see at least one really amazing technician who does stuff and doesn't need to be rescued. So, yeah.
Can I just add to that? We started we started an after-school coding club at a K-5 school in my community, and my daughter was like, she was 7, and she said, I don't think she wanted to do coding, and so she said, I don't think that my friends will join. They won't think it's a girl thing, and she was in 2nd grade, and I was like, ah!
Yeah.
So we made it an all-girls club, and it fixed it, and then we started to see parity as soon as the girls had their own club, and you could actually see the data as the kids matriculate, and now she's in 5th grade, and we don't have an all-girls coding, so we thought we'd fix it, and this year with the hour of code, it dropped right back down again, so it's really amazing. They must be getting it at home.
I think it's an uphill climb, and I think there's just a lot of. This is why, like, I focus on the very basics. Like, let's just not perpetuate it with things that we're presenting as neutral, right? So, yeah.
Your last graph.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing is the environmental sciences.
Isn't that interesting?
That is also very gender biased because they've done studies about being concerned about the environment is seen as kind of being a sissy thing.
Yep. Yes.
If you're green, that's kind of early.
Yep.
And so that would explain why that is the highest one, because men wouldn't be as willing to go into it.
And the other one is interesting too, by the way, is biomedical is the next highest. And, there's space in medicine for women. We know there's persistent achievement gaps. I know you all know this, so I'm just saying, yep, here's an example. It happens. It's continuous. So what can we do? Like, from a technology perspective, right? We're not necessarily in the classroom every day. We're not necessarily interacting with students. Hopefully we're not standing there and saying you don't belong in my classroom. But what can we do about these subtle messages, and where are they? How can you learn to see them so that when you're building, and we already did the survey of how many of us are guilty of taking a paper form and turning it into a crappy electronic form. I own it. I've done it. How do we build those systems or select those systems that are supportive and inclusive and adaptable and non-binary? So I'm also going to add, my first rule is treat data with caution. At my heart and soul, I'm a security person. If you don't need the data, don't collect it. If you don't know how you're going to protect it, don't collect it. I mean, I understand the power of data, and you can use data for good, but you can also use that same data for bad. There was an initiative there was a legislative initiative to collect sexual orientation for Oregon students. And I was like, you're talking about people in K-12, they're still figuring out who they are. And I understand wanting to make data-based decisions, but who's determining that student's orientation? Is it I looked at you and decided that you look gay, and I checked the box? Because we know that happens in other things. Or are you expecting students to self-identify to you? I mean, some students are not going to do that. They're not going to be comfortable. It's not safe. And then how are you protecting data that could be life or death data in a place where we still have people being killed for their sexual orientation in a country where that happens? So treat data with caution. Only take what you need. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes it's mandated. So let's talk about names. At the very heart and soul of who we are, we have a name. So my first rule is look at making the ability to make names inclusive, adaptable, and customizable. This comes down to having options for having a legal name, right? You have needs sometimes to know what somebody's legal name is, and having a preferred name. What does somebody want to be called? And my work on this started with the transgender community, but what I learned was something really interesting. I was talking to somebody down in Grants Pass about this. I was with a room of developers who were trying to struggle with how are we going to make our new student information system more inclusive. And I'm in a homogenous room of guys. And all of a sudden one goes, oh my gosh, I get this. This happens to me all the time. And we all look at him and we're like, okay, tell us more. He's like, his name is Al. He goes by Al. That's his preferred name. He says, well, he looks at all his coworkers and he says, what y'all don't know is my legal name is Allison. And he's like, and it causes me more problems because I get misidentified, I get misgendered, I get all the time. So boom, he automatically got it. Your name is really a key part of who you are. So offering the ability to have a legal name versus a preferred name is really important in your systems. Some legacy systems can't do this. That's why at ODE we wrote some alternative language in there to give you permission to put a person's actually preferred name in if it was a health and safety issue. You got to keep people safe, right? The other thing is special characters. We are entering a generation of people who grew up with Twitter. You are going to get kids with names with special characters, I guarantee you. Because, Twitter things, right? This is actually the name of a friend of mine. This is his legal name. He's 67 years old. He retired and decided he'd always hated his name. And he changed it. And his name is Gray Pony with a 3. Unfortunately, the state in which he lives in, their information systems can't print him a driver's license with a number in the name field. So think about these things. When you look at your name field, can it accommodate a number? Can it accommodate a special character? The longest name that I could find anywhere was 37 characters. It was a Hawaiian name. It included an apostrophe. Can you handle an apostrophe? Or are you automatically not naming somebody correctly because your system can't handle it? Name structures are cultural. In the United States, we tend to have a first, a middle, and a last. Other places have like a string of names. Can you accommodate a string of names? Can you accommodate a hyphenated last name or 2 last names? Or, one of my favorite examples, my mom, who I mentioned earlier, graduated from a university that couldn't accommodate a name without a middle name. My mother has no middle name. So what they slapped her maiden name into his middle name field, which, by the way, is not her legal name. And that's what's on her diploma, because their computer system couldn't handle a person with no middle name. So names, having adaptable name fields is one key element to help people feel welcome and included. If I can't get your name right, I have failed right there up front immediately. Okay. Expand your gender and sex assigned at birth options beyond binary choices. So let's talk just a little bit about the difference between gender and sex assigned at birth. Your gender identity is like who you wake up as. Like I wake up I feel female. I'm a female person. People's gender identity do not always align with their sex assigned at birth, like the body parts, the organs that they have. Which, by the way, is not a binary choice. Male, female, female, male, other/intersex. There are a good number of people in the population who are born with multiple combinations of various organs, male and female. So, getting away from the thought that you are either male or female and those are the only things, and that your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity are necessarily the same thing, becomes important. Now, traditionally, birth certificates come with, you get a male or female designation. This is actually a picture of the first birth certificate that was released just a few years ago, identifying somebody as intersex. Because it traditionally was, like, if you were born, they weren't sure, they couldn't decide, they'd be like, okay, mom and dad, you pick. And the parent was responsible for selecting whether their child was going to be male or female. That's changing, but then you have to have a system that can support that change. Less important if you're looking first at like gender versus sex assigned at birth. I work in a medical clinic. We're more concerned with what you got because we do medical stuff. And then how you identify so we can call you appropriately. And just to add complexity to this is why I say go with female, male, intersex as your three options, because there is actually something like 19 versions of intersex, and this is only a small subset of them. And that's way too much detail. Then unless you're a doctor, you really don't need to know.
What's ODE? They're adding the third.
Okay, so yeah, ODE was going with male, female, and declined to answer. The last I heard. And here's a better option for a drop-down tool. I actually just took this out of my system I'm implementing right now. I would make some changes to it, but it's not bad. Female, male, trans male, transgender, I don't want to tell you which version, gender nonconforming, and different identity. If I were to edit these fields to make them exactly what I want, I would make cis female and cis male, rather than assuming that the norm is cis to be female or male, and then adding the word trans. And I would add non-binary as opposed to non-conforming. But those are requests I've already put into the company to normalize this data a little bit more. But this gives people an option to select how they want to be identified. And then it tells the people who are working with that data, this is who I'm working with, and how they want to be identified, and how they want to be talked about. So the system that we're in the process of implementing, when I went out to look for a system, I was like, when you stand up and you call somebody up, you want to be able to call them by the correct name. And when you're talking to or about them, you want to use the correct pronouns. And give them the option of what pronouns you want to be called by. So where I work, we actually have name badges that have our pronouns on it. And when we introduce ourselves, it's like, hi, I'm Amy. I use she, her pronouns. It gives the other person the opportunity to inform us what pronouns they use. Because, I mean, you've all met people who are sort of neutral and you're not sure. This makes it easy to get the right pronoun to the right person. Again, making them feel like they belong and not making them uncomfortable. This is fun in my new system. It has automatically, you can choose her, she, or she, her, hers, me, him, his, and they, them, theirs, or you can type in your own pronouns, which was hilarious. Like, it generated some entertaining conversation. Somebody said, well, I want to have my pronouns be Stardust. I'm like, okay. So I started making sentences that had that in it, and giving people the agency to be able to determine how they wish to be referred to.
How do you pronounce in this situation the Z?
Zers.
But because her, if you're speaking, it sounds visually you can say that's not her self, but if you're verbally.
Yeah, I don't know many people who use these or zers. Most people I know who are non-binary use they, them, theirs, which is a little awkward when your brain has been trained for 40 years to use that as a plural, but
So I've done some surveys where I allow people to put in their choice, so they don't have a selection, but
yeah.
it's like a choice, and then one of the selections is, I don't feel comfortable responding.
Yes. That's always a great selection too.
And one thing that I've seen, particularly because a lot of my surveys work with middle and high school boys in particular, is that you get, when you give a choice, you do get some of the, I'm an attack helicopter, which is the classic example if you've ever come across that one. I don't know, have you come across that one?
I haven't come across that
the
one,
attack
but
helicopter, that's actually, and I didn't know this when I first came in. I got it on one and I was like, what the hell?
what the heck? Yeah.
Okay, so it's actually an online thing which comes off I'm pretty sure it comes off like 4chan or Reddit.
Yeah, it's yeah.
It's basically an attack thing. It's like, oh, you can't choose your gender. If you can choose your gender, then I can choose to be an attack helicopter. And there's like a whole meme kind of thing.
And you just let them do it.
Yeah, my
fine.
concern with some of this, like, I get to type in my pronouns, is if it becomes a public thing, there are going to be some, like, almost attacking things. People are going to go, I'm going to choose my pronouns and I'm going to be an attack helicopter. And if that becomes a public thing, you immediately create this antagonistic relationship that turns this into a non-safe exercise for students who do it.
I get that. The flip side is that you want students to be able to be called how they want to be called. So this is really about my relationship as a student with the person who is an adult, right? I mean, if I got this and it said I'm an attack helicopter, I would be, and that was printed out on my sheet. This is how you're gonna, I'd be like, okay, so let's have a conversation about who you are and how you want me to refer to you as a learning piece. Because you can't blame. I mean, that's just going to be ridiculous. But and there's an educational opportunity there to say, okay, I get that you're messing around. I mean, on a survey, it's a little different. When you're actually using a system to interact with somebody and call them correctly, you can say, okay, ha. Now tell me, are you a he or a she or a they? What do you want to be called? It's just about my respect for you. How do you want me to talk to you? And about you. And I think you can use that as a teachable moment for people to do that. But this opens up the option for students who want to make sure they're referred to correctly and don't want to persistently have to say, no, I'm not a he, I'm a she. Over and over again. Or I don't identify as a she, I'm non-binary. Please use they and them. And having worked with students who are having to repeat that message all day long to people, it becomes a drag on who they are. It's like, my gosh, I just wanted to get up today and be a student, and I have to campaign for my rights again.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think it's great. I think I think that's the way to go. But I
know there's always going to be one
of things.
Or two.
I have I have a kid who just graduated high school and two in high school right now, and my daughter in particular is really involved in gender sexual politics in her school and teaches classes for freshmen and stuff like that. So she does the whole pronoun thing. She knows all of that. She's really versed in it, and I'm really supportive of it. I'm also sometimes I see that attack side of it.
You see the bad behavior. And it's just how you handle, how do you use that as that teachable moment, or just go, okay, fine, you were being a jerk. I'm just going to not include your piece in my survey. I mean, it's a challenge. There's always going to be one. I guarantee it.
I wish there only was one.
Well, okay. Right now, in our current environment, there are going to be more.
The first time I thought it was one, and then I was like, there were 10 attack helicopters in the survey? How the hell did that happen?
Yeah, well, they also collude, right?
It was like, I mean, you always get the, I'm a Martian, and it's like, yeah, you're a goofball.
Yeah.
But, then when the same thing kept popping up, I was like, this has to be a thing,
and you had to Google it. Yeah. There is a sort of a pushback piece, right? Because while we try to do the right thing for people who are at risk, then there are other people who think it's their right to keep measuring on top of other people. I don't know how else to say that. Design systems to avoid implicit male bias. Subtitled, The Alphabet is Your Best Friend. So I was an English major. I love alphabetizing things. Like my brain barfs on bullet points if they're not alphabetized. I mean, I live like by the alphabet. I love it. Structure. The alphabet is your friend. You can justify the order of anything if you just say it's alphabetical. And it gets you out of so much trouble because it's a structure that we've accepted, A through Z. So alphabet is your friend, part 1. There are systems that have an implicit male bias. I ran into a system that where if you wanted to enter male, you hit a number 1. And if you wanted to enter female, you hit a number 2. Hello? What is that saying? 1? 2. Okay, it was probably just like lazy coding, but the message that you're sending over and over to the person who's hitting 1 and 2 is pretty loud and clear. Even if it's unintentional, it's like it's perpetuating something. The reason I found this out is that this was a hospital system. When you have a baby, they enter that your child is male or female. In that particular system, they didn't have an option for intersex, so you were male or female. My son, bless his heart, was female for 5 years. Because somebody made a typo and hit number 2 instead of number 1, and I didn't notice on his birth certificate for 5 years because I didn't sleep for 5 years because I was a parent. And all of a sudden I looked and went, oh dear, that's a shock. I did not know I have a daughter. And then I found out. They were like, oh, we must have hit a typo. You hit a 1 for a male and 2 for a female. And I was like, you what? Okay. Because that was just in and of itself shocking. So that's an example of.
So what would you rather have it though? Do you want the female to be 1 just because they?
How about an M or an F? I mean, that's logical, right? The alphabet is your friend.
Even if it just did it alphabetically, it would still be female first.
Exactly. And there are forms that come with order. Okay? This one is defensible because it's sort of alphabetical. Oh, no. Actually, Miss would technically be at the top. Mr., Mrs., Ms., Miss. Yeah. Okay. Point 1. Do you really need to know all that about a woman? There's a Mr., there's a Ms. But
None of you does time business.
Yeah, that's what it should be.
I used to have an example of British Airways, which is super awesome. It's like Lord, Lady, Baron, Baroness, honorable, blah, blah, blah. I love it. Just, yeah. Pope, you had like 60 choices, and then you had to provide documentation if you had a title, like I am the Lord of blah, blah, blah. This is one where, like, you could shorten this up, the alphabetical Mr. Miss. Traditional forms tend to do this. Traditional form, male, female. You've just given me that same 1-2 message again. How about female, male, prefer not to answer? That's alphabetical. Alphabetical. You can balance this thing, Mr., Ms., alphabetical, female, male, alphabetical. And now you have even parity. Guys get to be first on one, and gals get to be first on the other. And it takes out that I'm always number 2 message that comes through pretty loud and clear. I was really excited in a survey of like things I was looking at. I'm starting to see alphabetization being used more, which was really cool. This is my pet peeve. How many people are truly like one thing? Right? I know children from multi-ethnic or biracial families. This is a mental catch-22 that it's really important to avoid. Avoiding binary choices when having to check a race or ethnicity box, is really impossible. It's really hard, or it's really important because what you've done, if you give somebody a form that says, check your race, and it's a one checkbox form, you've just told a biracial child to pick between mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad and dad, but pick which parent you are related, kind of pick your parent, pick which one. You've also discounted for somebody who's multiracial, multi-ethnic, all of the things that they are, and said you got to pick one. It creates a dilemma. I actually have a friend who was telling me she went to school with a young man when they were in grade school, and she said they got to second grade and had this form they had to fill out, and he was half African American, half Caucasian, Irish, and he literally came to a dead stop in class and couldn't proceed with his learning because he couldn't figure out which box to check. Why do that to a kid? Why do that to anybody? So the answer to that is to give people options. And then to be thoughtful about what you ask for and how you ask for it. And this is back to the alphabet is your friend part 2. Okay, this is the worst example ever of what not to do, and this is from the U.S. Census Bureau. Thank you very much. Which I guess is, government. What is person one's race? Well, they did not alphabetize at all, and the first thing they stuck on here was white, which assumes that, again, back to that message of ordering. What are you saying? Oh, white, right? And then they have this really odd collection of things. If I were born in Africa, but I came to the United States as an immigrant, do I select black, African American, or Negro? Because I'm not actually, I might be from Ghana. So how do you resolve that? So this was the example of totally what not to do. And then, oddly enough, it's by the way, white is a homogenous category. If you are white, you have no ethnic or historical background or cultural. Have you been to Europe? Right? I mean, I'm a British national. I've been to Germany. They're really culturally very different. Russia, very different. A lot of us, some schools in Oregon have a high Russian population. It's a very different culture than white. What does that mean? Okay. So, examples of how not to ask. I want to give kudos to one of our school districts. I was out looking for examples that I felt were really good. And I understand in schools we're constrained. We have to ask things based on a federal model. But I wanted to call out Portland Public. And they've had a rough couple weeks, so kudos to Portland Public for this awesome example. Because first of all, they explained why they're asking for it. Federal and state regulations require PPS to gather this information for statistical reports. And then they ask the standard questions. Is your child of Hispanic or Latino origin, yes or no? What races do you consider your child? And then they alphabetize. Asian, Black, Native American, Native Hawaiian, white. Okay, they still have the white bread white thing in there. But that's because, again, it's that federal construct. Back to the Census Bureau. These are the required things that you don't have a lot of choices about. This is not how I would construct it if I were asking, but I have more options. And then they go on for more detail. Please provide the following additional information to assist us in better representing and responding to our students' racial ethnic identities. What races do you consider your child? Mark all that apply. And they've got African American, African, a whole list of possible countries, plus the ability to write in, other black. You could check here and go Afro-English. Okay? Afro-Irish. 3% of the population of Scotland is black. So you could be an Afro-Scot. And they have space for that. They have a place for you to be inclusive. Then you've got a bazillion tribes and options. Asian, Hispanic, lots of options. Pacific Islander. And then they've got white, Romanian, Russian, Ukrainian, European countries. Other white. If you would like to share in your own words how you describe your child's race, origin, ethnicity, and ancestry or tribal affiliations, please use this space. This is the most amazingly inclusive collection. And again, alphabet is your friend. They alphabetized it. It takes out any implication of priority. You cannot go wrong with alphabetization. So I just love this example. I was wow, this is amazing. Because even though you had to live within the federal guidelines, you took that and you pulled it out and got more information. It could be really helpful. The last thing I want to talk about is visuals. As systems have become more graphic driven, we've had the option to add a lot of visuals. And visuals can send messages too. In fact, we know from marketing that visuals send a lot of messages all the time. But when we're designing or selecting systems, look at the visual messages that those systems are sending. Because those messages have impact on our students day in and day out. And I'm picking an example from a college that shall remain nameless. It's not the university I work for. I just want to say that. But I happen to be standing there looking at these brochures and flyers, which are paper versions. They have online versions of this. And going, are you kidding me? Huh. So let's start with this one. Implied authority and status. This is the advertising for a business management program on the left, and for a business technology program, which subtext administrative support. Wow, check out the message you just sent. That's your flyer. Okay, I am looking for a career. You've just told me that I am in the support role. And by the way, this was consistent throughout the brochures. Like somewhere in business management, you might find a woman sort of in a corner. There were no guys in the business technology program flyer at all, which, by the way, I know some really great admin assistants who are guys, and they love what they do, and they have a really hard time getting a job because there's a stereotype that guys don't do administrative assistants. And some of them are really amazing at it. I hired one out of the Air Force. He was fantastic. And that's what he'd done in the Air Force, and he was the best ever. But there was a bias against him. Bias goes both ways, and that's why I want to say, the other thing about gender is that you've now limited young men who might want to do support work and be fabulous at it the same way you're limiting women with those visual representations. This is my other favorite set of, this is where I was going, because I was looking through a whole wall of flyers. So on the left, you have auto mechanics, building inspectors, electronics, and welding. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, all male. On the right, you have early childhood education, nursing, and women's studies, all female. Again, limiting on both sides. Men, you do not get to work with small children. Hate to tell you, we know you can't handle it. You're going to drop that baby on their head. Not okay. We all know this isn't true. There are just as many men who are wonderful with small children, and plenty who are better with small children than I will ever be. But the messaging in the visuals is loud and clear. So as you're looking at those IT systems, especially when we look at curricula and systems that are attached to our learning, visual representation is really important to be aware of. It's a lens that we look through to say, how is this going to be seen by our students? It doesn't mean that every picture of an early childhood education person should be a guy. It means, how do we represent both groups of people, a wide range of people, based on race, color, physical attributes, gender, whatever. How do we have an inclusive visual that makes it so that we're not just pushing people into specific tracks? Because one of the amazing things about our education system in the United States is that you actually don't get necessarily tracked as early as other countries. My mom grew up in England. She took the 11 plus exam, which basically was like your university track, your technical school track. Boom, at 11. Right? We don't do that as here, so let's not do it subliminally. Be more inclusive in those visuals. So my closing on this is to create inclusion with simple mindfulness that others might have a different reality from your own. To put on your lens and say, wow, this neutral computer system that I am either purchasing or designing, is it really neutral? Is it sending any messages that are going to rub that experience? Students are already getting a wealth of other messages from our culture, from our politics? Are we subliminally sending messages that are reinforcing that without intending to? It's not going to solve every problem in the world. But if it makes it that much easier for one student to show up in your classroom and not feel like I'm so done with you because you can't even get my name right, or you keep calling me the wrong thing, or I don't fit in your box, then we've removed one hurdle. And just like the bad things can be cumulative, the removal of those hurdles is also cumulative. So my challenge to you is to put those glasses on when you're looking at systems that you're evaluating, or when you're designing, or when you get that really old form that's on paper and somebody says, please make this electronic. Don't just repeat it. Let's evaluate it and make it better. Make it awesome. Because we can do better. And maybe you'll think nobody will notice. But somebody will notice. That student who didn't have to make a horrible choice or didn't feel like they were not included in just filling out a form will have an opportunity. I want to give credit to the artwork in this. It was done by one of my student designers and one of my employees. I have her permission to tell you that she did the art. This is her self-portrait. And so I wanted to share that with you. If you're looking for a graphic design person, she's graduating, please hire her. Anyway, thank you. Any questions? Lots of questions. Go for it.
One is an observation, something you should look for, and it's not something you actually mentioned in that last piece of graphics. My daughter just chose college, and she's been getting a lot of mailings from lots of universities. She got one from, I think I'll mention them. She got one from the University of Idaho. There were no students of color on that. And usually it was really noticeable because, almost all of these brochures, they have like the kids skipping across campus, and there's like every shade of kid.
Right.
And the University of Idaho had no students of color except in the picture of the football team.
Exactly. And by the way, that's a total stereotype, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You only go to college if you're an athlete and you're a person of color.
Yeah, African American males are only athletes.
Or only athletes.
And I hear that a lot even at the high school. It's
yeah.
like,
and if you're a non-athletic African American male, what are
Yeah,
I don't believe that, but that's an attitude.
I mean, I even hear it from my kids. It's like, how do you think that makes those African American kids feel that they're not good at this and therefore they're not? They almost seem like they're mascots.
Right.
In high school. It's weird. It makes me extremely uncomfortable.
It is. It's a very strange experience. Yes, that's a great example.
The other question I have is slightly more. So I was aware of what happens when you ask people their ethnicity at the beginning of the standardized test or whatever. It drops the scores for kids with students of color. So what I try to do when I do a survey is I'll put that question at the end.
That is the perfect place to put it.
But the question that I have is, has anybody done research on asking your name of transgender students and what effect that has on their testing score at the beginning, like their legal name? I don't ask legal name, I only ask name. So whatever they give me, they give them.
That's a great question. To my best of my knowledge, nobody has done research on that yet. But I think it'll be coming. Somebody will do it. I think by not asking legal name, that is helpful because it doesn't trigger that danger space. They put what they identify as, especially in K-12 because students don't have necessarily the ability to legally change their name until they're older. So a lot of times they'll be using a use name that they're going to legally change to later.
Do they have to be 18?
You don't have to be 18, but you get into parental consent, financial ability to actually do the paperwork. If you don't have money, it's hard to do. There's less research on transgender students right now. There's plenty of research like on women doing poorly in math tests because you put the gender thing at the front, not at the back. But a placement is really important. On the medical side, like when I do this for medical people, it's like, gender really doesn't matter. It's like, we've actually gone to organ inventories. Because really what I need to know is what's in your body as a medical person. right? I mean, I have a transgender friend who got a notification that she needed a pap smear. She's like, I wasn't born with those parts, right? I mean, great that you think I'm that female, but I don't need that. But, depending on your age and any surgeries you have, you may not need that either. So, but yeah, there's definitely room for research about how more of these triggers happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming it would have the same effect.
That would be my assumption too.
Maybe even without it, but I wondered if anyone had actually done
Not
the work around it.
Not to the best of my knowledge. Me personally, right now, I would do what you're doing, err on the side of caution, and just avoid triggering that by keeping it to whatever you want to be called. But that's a great question. Somebody should do some research on that. Yeah.
Sounds like you have kind of the ear of the legislature, kind of, right?
Well, no, I wish, but that would be awesome.
I'm just curious, and this might be at the federal, it probably is at the federal level. American Indian, Native American designation bugs the crap out of me. How do they, one's a mistake and one is, when you put the word Native into anything, you denigrate a little. The natives are restless. It has bad, for me,
Right.
It has bad connotations at least. How do those things get decided? These are.
Your U.S. Census Bureau actually has a lot of it was funny. The U.S. Census Bureau, it wasn't funny, but it was interesting. It says American Indian, and later it says Asian Indian. Or what I sometimes refer to as India Indian.
Yeah.
That's how my friend from India refers to it. She's like, I'm an India Indian. Because she's like, in America, it's really confusing. A lot of that starts at the federal level and gets driven down. That's why I liked Portland's ability. Like, they check the federal stuff and kind of okay, not to the feds. You have to check these bots. Tell us all about you. And some of these, there's no perfect way because, I'm part Cherokee. I know people who are like, yeah, I'm an American Indian. And I know people who are like, don't call me that, I'm a Native American. And then any kind of range in between. I'm a First Person, I'm an Indigenous. There's...
I'm trying to research that sort of thing. What do people want to be called?
Right, and I think...
I know someone you can talk to if you want to seriously to it's like an
Yeah, and I think that there's a huge range in what people want to be called.
Right.
And some of that is also based on, quite frankly, I've seen based on your age. Which generation were you part of?
Right.
And so what is your generational norm as well as your preference as those people? That's where I'm circle the one. List them all and let people select. I'm kind of put them all out there and let people just tell you, invite them to tell you who they are. I would actually run out of space on that form because I'm the other white, English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Cherokee, Mexican, checked all these boxes. But I think that inviting people to building systems that are open so that you can bring more information in, recognizing that, yes, you have to have a core level of data that you ship back to the feds and to the state, and that's what they use to aggregate certain things. But for your own information and for your students' validation and to inform who they see themselves as, I'm fling the door open.
Well, did Portland Public Schools have a place for those data fields that they added?
They must. I mean, they're putting them in somewhere. I haven't called them up to say, hey, where does this go when you get it in there? But I think it's fabulous that they even are that inclusive in their options for how you check the box.
And how they translate it back. So that worries me, how they decide, oh, this means this or this means that. It's a little worrisome.
Yeah, there are
Because
pieces.
they have to translate to something else if they have to.
Oh, well, that's why they had both sections. They have the Fed section at the top.
Okay.
And then they have the section that's really for them.
Okay.
That is actually much better. Because I used to be the person who gets all your data from the schools, right? And I'd be like, you got to check the boxes. I'm sorry, the boxes suck. So I love the way they did this. They took here's the I'm sorry, the boxes suck section is little, and here's why we're asking you to this stuff, and then, oh, by the way, tell us all about you.
It's worth noting, and you probably know this already, it's worth noting on the official ethnicity is that in all the years of the U.S. Census, like the 10-year U.S. Census, the race and ethnicity section has never been identical from one census to the next. Definitions have always changed, so you can't correlate data, particularly around Latino. You can't correlate data around
1 year to the next
from across 10 years. Any attempt to compare U.S. Census data is skewed, and it's also skewed. I mean, this is an interesting thing that I just happen to know is the number of people who identified as Native American increased exponentially between 1960 and 1970 with the growth of like the power movements in the late 60s. More people identified Native American in a positive sense and were prepared to identify themselves. And it was a huge percentage increase occurred between 60 and 70 people checking it. And it was all tied, there was the occupation of Alcatraz and things like that, those are the high profile things. But it became a cool identity to have in a kind of counterculture, and people identified as Native American. In the early 60s, they didn't. It was seen as and that's a generational thing.
It's a generational thing. The other thing is a safety thing.
Yeah.
Back to safety. So I'm part Cherokee and part Mexican and lots of parts British, all kinds, which is very entertaining because, the Scots, the English, the Welsh, they all get along great. I got all of that mashed in there. But my great-grandmother was illegally married because it's in Mississippi. And race laws down there said that white men did not marry Native American Mexican women. So that identity piece, in her time period, you don't tell. You were passing, you were hiding. Whereas now, or starting in the 60s, the safety of being who you are starts to increase. So there's also there's historical context. The historical context around this category that's like what I call white bread white, really goes back to the early days of colonialism, where you had slaves from Africa. I was a history major. Sorry if I'm boring you. It's okay. I'm sorry. But you had slaves from Africa. You had a huge number of indentured servants from like Ireland and other parts of Europe who were essentially slaves for 10, 20 years, which if your lifespan is under 40, that's a lifetime. And all living in the same place. And these rich plantation owners suddenly figured out, crap, if these people get along, we're in trouble. So they purposely built the construct of white versus black to separate two groups of people who were in servitude and elevate one above another so they wouldn't align and toss out their people who were holding the control. And that is the root of your construct, because early on there were efforts by those groups to rebel, to take back their freedom. And so that is like one of the roots of today's challenges and problems, is that it was a very specific decision to build a separation based on the color of somebody's skin. So there you go. That was my history lesson for the day. Thank y'all. I am a history nerd. I love history. But it just fascinates me that you see that trailing through right down to the census category that says white. Like, oh my gosh, if you are light-skinned, you are all the same.
What do you think about the Hispanic, non-Hispanic flag?
I've struggled with that one too, because I'm like, they do weird stuff with that data. Like if you check that, you may be Hispanic and Irish and African American, and those next two just go, boom, you're Hispanic. And I'm like, that's weird, because that just like, from a data perspective, that, I mean, yeah, you can check all those boxes, but from a data perspective, you ended up in this plot. And I find that really strange.
Seems like a policy byproduct, but kind of nice.
Well, my friend Gray Pony has this great point, which I think is actually brilliant. He always checks other and writes human in the race category.
My husband does that too.
Because he's like, really? There's one race, and then you have a whole bunch of ethnicities and cultures and phenotypes. And so your question about the Hispanic, non-Hispanic gets to that in terms of that's more of a culture. You know, I mean, that's like you can have a box that says, you know, Russian, non-Russian.
What
or
do we do with that data? That's the question. Like, I mean, now that we have it. But as you mentioned, you started with.
What do you do with it?
Collect it. If you don't need it, don't collect it.
Don't collect it.
Why do you need it?
That's a great question. You know, and they think, you know, some of that is tracking.
There's the same issue with the multi-ethnic section. And, you know, having engaged back when they changed the collection, I was working for a school district. Now I work for an ASD, so I'm not on the front lines quite as much with teachers. But I had teachers who'd be like, I'd send them like their data, and they'd be like, but I have more African American kids. I have more black kids. And I'd be like, well, technically on our count, that kid's multi-ethnic. But the teachers see that kid as African American. Mm-hmm. They don't see that kid as multi-ethnic. If a kid looks black, they see a kid as being black. That's the effect they have on that kid.
Yeah.
They don't see multi-ethnic kids in the same way. If a multi-ethnic kid looks quote-unquote white, they see that kid as white. They don't say, and they treat them, their bias or whatever works on that kid's skin color. Teachers do that. No, I'm not all. Not all. I'm not. I'm just but you know, there's been a lot of work around implicit bias and so on, and there's a lot of evidence to show that African American males in particular are discriminated against in discipline
differently.
Much more. So you can, the irony of that situation is then you can have a kid who a teacher sees as African American, although they're on our count as multi-ethnic, and a kid who a teacher sees as white, who is also on our count as multi-ethnic. But multi-ethnic doesn't create a bias situation or anything because the teacher sees that kid as African American and the teacher sees that kid as white, regardless of how we identify them. So trying to use them as a data point is almost impossible because it actually is to the advantage because it sort of hides, because it removes multi-ethnic kids are moved out of the underserved population. Although many kids who are multi-ethnic are seen in their schools as being in the underserved population. Right. So by moving them out of that section, it reduces population, which reduces sometimes what you have to report. Because, I only have 5 African American students, therefore I'm an asterisk. But that's because you move 15 into multi-ethnic. And now you're talking about multi-ethnic, but multi-ethnic isn't the same identity and they're not approached in the same way.
And that's the back-end challenges of the data. And that's an awesome discussion because that can be really interesting. I'm starting from the front end of like, what is that student experience? What is that person interacting with your systems experience? Then there becomes this whole question of what do you do with that on the back end? And how do you, because there is value in being able to say, we know that, you know, I'll pick on girls because I am one. So it's easier for me to go there. You know, that we see achievement levels different in like math based on gender, right? Because that's the kind of stuff you're looking for. And this is why, for example, when I'm working with transgender students, it's like, okay, exactly to that point, that student in your classroom is presenting as female, therefore they should be in that category. Because that teacher is going to see them and interact with them as female. And so you don't want them sitting in the guy count for how you're using that data later to get a real accurate picture of how that experience is for that student. But yeah, it becomes a really good question of how do you deal with that data later, and how do you aggregate it in a way that serves the students and doesn't hide inequities in the system. That's another.
It's really strong, and I'm 100% in agreement with you. Be thoughtful about the data collection and the way that you're approaching the data collection and what that is. Totally agree. Google Forms. Holy crap. The ability to put together a form is easier than ever.
Yes.
And every school that I work with, as soon as they're into Google Docs, starts generating forms. If it's for exit tickets, that's fine, but they're starting to collect student information beyond just, the run-of-the-mill answer this question or here's 5. And it's actually informative for branching logic. So now you can actually build, like a psychometrician, you can build an exam with if this, then that.
Right.
And if this, then that's wrong. And I'm not sure we've done enough teaching of teachers to help them understand implicit bias and the way you approach.
I don't think we have it all.
There's a question about that.
Because,
I'm just worried for.
I think you're totally right.
Forms in general.
I mean,
it's gone too far already.
I came to this through things that just annoyed the heck out of me all the time, and through working with students who were like, I hate your system. I never get called the right name. I never get called the right pronouns, which I'm changing that system. So, but people have a lot of, teachers and other people have a lot of ability just to self-generate now. They don't have to come through IT to do a lot of this. Stuff that used to take me 3 weeks of coding now takes 5 seconds in Google Forms. Mm-hmm. It's a little demoralizing for those 3 weeks I spent back in 1995, And I think that you're right. There's a need to have that conversation about computer systems are not neutral, so let's make sure we're cognizant and thoughtful about how we present information, how we ask for information. And then, oh my gosh, and what are you asking and what are you going to do with it? Because some things are just dangerous data to have. There's a country that will remain nameless that was the master of data collection and perpetuated massive genocide using that data. I mean, these are the things that...
There's been more than one, to be fair.
Okay, there's more than one. There's one that stands out in my mind because I have family history around, bombs dropping on my relatives. But, data can be used for really bad things, so be careful about what you're collecting and how you're using it. It really becomes critical. But I think that that's a conversation we don't have enough of. We have a lot of conversation about, wow, we can do this cool thing. It's not, can you do it? It's, should you do it? How do you do it that you're not causing a bigger problem than you're solving?
Thinking about that enough.
So.
It's also, top down to bottom up kind of thing. In my code, I do it alphabetically. Females are first. But as I'm building the form, another one of those gave me a paper thing, and now I have to put it in digital,
right.
happy form there. I was like, I should do this alphabetically. I'm like, no, because I'm going to get, I'm going to have to redo it. And people are going to be like, why are you doing this? That's not how it's supposed to be. I'm like, because it's alphabetical. Why is male first? Give me a good, rational reason why male is first.
Yep. Exactly. Right.
But then we just had a discussion. We're having a discussion about this, and there were 2 guys in the room.
We had a good conversation, though, didn't we?
Oh no, I'm not saying it's not, but I'd just like to point out there are 2 guys in this room.
Right.
At this conference, this is seriously statistically unrepresentative of this conference.
Right? That's a challenge, right?
Sorry, I'm a data and evaluation coordinator. I should point that out.
And in their defense, well, upstairs, they're his defense.
There you go.
Pronoun practice. They're upstairs in security training, which is, at the end of the day, if there's a breach of security or information accuracy, I'm not sure which one I'd choose.
I choose both, right? I just don't know which one I'd pick. Well, I'm here because, I'm talking.
Is there some kind of bias that you were put at the same time?
I'm being flippant.
But
I think we're having good conversation.
It's interesting. The first time I did this, I did a training on this for the Community College Council on Institutional Research, and then I did a separate one for all the developers at Grants Pass at Rogue Community College. So CCIR is fairly 50-50. Institutional research tends to be a zone where gender distribution is pretty even. The developers, I was the only woman there. And it was a fabulous conversation. They really dug in and we had a great conversation. It was fantastic. And I think that having those opportunities to have those conversations with people whose hands are in is really great. So if people ever want me to come talk to their groups, I'm totally happy to do that. My theory, like as you heard, bias hurts people in all directions. I think that if somebody wants to go into a field like nursing, it shouldn't be predicated on whether you're a male or female. And then the term nurse is like so offensive to me. I'm like, no, you're a nurse. Just like I'm not a woman technician, that's not a male nurse. You're a technician, you're a nurse. We shouldn't be having to attach a gender when you're a minority to that. So these kinds of bias hurt people in so many directions that I just feel like there's room for everybody to have a piece in a conversation. Because limitations are limitations, whether you were considered privileged or not. That's not what I feel like we in education are about. For me, in education, the sky's the limit, right? Or beyond, to infinity and beyond. Okay. I steal movie quotes all the time, but that's I don't think it's a girl or a guy or a person of color conversation. I think it's a conversation about how we all get there.
I stopped reading a book to my children when they were little. It was a Berenstain Bears one. And your thoughts, I know, and that's not, but
No, I know it's so prevalent. And then you read it, you're like, oh.
But one of the, at first glance, you're like, oh yes, power to the women, da 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 da. But it was really in reverse. It was telling the little girl, you can be a doctor, you can be an engineer, you can be a race car driver. The next stage wasn't telling the little boy, you can be a nurse, you can be a teacher, you can do, which implicitly says that these things are to be aspired to, and these are second place.
And it's really insidious. Like we have a doctor where I work. She was telling me this the other day. It was quite enlightening, because she brought her kids up without television, and she said that they were, she came home from work one day and her son looked at her. He was 7, and he said, "So what do you do at work?" She's like, "Well, I'm a doctor." And he's like, "No, you're a nurse." And she's like, "No, I'm a doctor." He's like, "You can't be a doctor. You're a girl." And she's like, "What did I do wrong?" Right?
Shouldn't let him watch TV.
She didn't let him watch TV, and yet somehow he's still soaked in, and maybe it was the Berenstain Bears. I don't know. But somehow he's soaked in at 7 years old that his mother couldn't possibly be a doctor. She had to be a nurse. And she was like, "No, I am a doctor. Do you want to come to work and see that I am a doctor? It's on the wall. It says doctor." But it was a real, those kind of messages are really persistent. So,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm trying to figure out. So Steve did not come back to rescue me. So I'm
Is this recording you?
Yes.